At the end of the 18th century, the Islamic empires were already on the decline, but then a series of events would greatly reshape the region, starting with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. This invasion made a great deal of sense in many regards. Francois Baron de Tott had been helping modernize the Persian army, but through secret trips, he reported that Egypt would be an easy conquest. And this was pretty true, as the ruling Mamluks were often fighting each other or the Ottomans. Plus, once in control, the French could begin construction on the Suez Canal and join forces with Tipu Sultan of Mysore in India. He had long been a French ally, and with their support again, he could drive the British from India. There were other more romantic ideals, like Napoleon sought to emulate Alexander the Great, and French intellectuals were infatuated with ancient Egypt. And in many of Napoleon's speeches to his troops, he referenced the Roman Empire. When he arrived in the country, he declared, "For too long this horde of slaves, bought in the Caucasus and Georgia, have tyrannized the most beautiful part of the world. But God, on whom all depends, has ordained that their empire shall end." These foreign Mamluks, which had ruled Egypt for centuries, were defeated at the Battle of the Pyramids by Napoleon, and under the leadership of Murad Bey, they fled further inland, leaving the French in control of Cairo. Napoleon had to quell rebellions and their fleet was destroyed. Nevertheless, Napoleon marched on into the Levant. There he met Djazar Pasha. He had just crushed a number of rebellions in the region and took control of Damascus. But now he was forced to face Napoleon, who besieged Jaffa. Although the city fell to the French, disease and lack of supplies forced them to abandon the city. In the end, Napoleon had to retreat from Palestine and eventually Egypt by 1801. So the British, Ottomans, and their vassals had won, but a power vacuum was left behind. Husrev Pasha, who led a few thousand Ottoman troops in support of Britain, was put in control by the Sultan. However, he had to try to contain the powerful Mamluks. But the Mamluks were equally divided. Many Mamluks, including Murad Bey, had joined the French forces. Others fled with the British at the end of the campaign, and those that remained had seized central Egypt, fought one another, and hoped to be restored as the rulers of the country. Husrev Pasha, however, could not march south to meet them, because he could not pay his Bashi Bazouks. These were irregular forces who largely came from Albania, Kurdistan, and the Caucasus, and they were often famed for their savagery. He tried to disband the group, but the Bashi Bazouk rebelled. Under Tahir Pasha, they seized the citadel, bombarded the palace of Husrev Pasha, and forced him to flee. Now, largely Albanian irregular troops were in control of the capital, and the Mamluks from the Caucasus were rebelling in the south. But the same financial problems existed. Tahir Pasha's solution was to stop paying the Turkish troops, but they just rebelled and killed him. This left Muhammad Ali in control of the remaining Albanian forces. He knew he had to deal with the Turkish troops, so he concluded an alliance with the leader of the Mamluks, known as Ibrahim Bey. Together they forced the Turkish troops out of Cairo and Damietta, and Ibrahim Bey was made the governor, but Muhammad Ali had real power. In the summer of 1803, the Ottomans sent a new governor, known as Teblusa Ali Pasha. He landed in Alexandria, took over nearby towns like Rosetta, and set up an opposing government. There was a bit of a stalemate between the two governments, as neither was strong enough to advance, or they couldn't even pay their own soldiers. To break the deadlock, the Turks tried to divide the Albanians and the Mamluks, by offering annual pensions to the Mamluks if they lay down their arms. Many accepted, so the Turks advanced on Cairo. But Muhammad Ali still managed to put together a large force and marched out to meet them, forcing Treblusu to surrender. However, there would be further divisions among the Mamluks. Muhammad Ali's Mamluk allies were now led by al-Badisi. But in early 1804, a new enemy appeared. The Mamluk named Muhammad Bey al-Alfi returned to Egypt. He had left the country with the British, but now he was gathering troops in Giza, ready to hit Cairo. Muhammad Ali, though, struck first, and forced al-Alfi's troops into the desert. The public were now fully behind the Albanians, especially when the other Mamluk leader, al-Badisi, raised taxes. The people began to rebel and attacked the homes of the Mamluks. Al-Badisi fled into the desert to raid his enemies' towns, while the Albanians in the city sent for Husrev Pasha. He was the Ottoman governor, and he could have brought some stability to the country. However, he also brought in thousands of Kurdish cavalrymen to bolster his position, greatly worrying the Albanians. So, to recap, we now have two Mamluk armies, both fighting Muhammad Ali and each other. They're off in the southern towns, while in the capital, Kurdish cavalrymen are protecting the Ottoman governor, and Muhammad Ali and his Albanian irregular troops are fighting against them. To make matters more complicated though, because of the governor's high taxes, Islamic scholars began to support Muhammad Ali, and so too did Syrian cavalrymen. Protests erupted once again in the capital, the governor fled to the citadel, and the Ottomans ordered him to step down. The rulers in Constantinople finally realized that Muhammad Ali, who had the support of the protesters, should be the ruler of Egypt in 1805. But there were still the Mamluks in the south, and bandits roamed the countryside. Muhammad Ali therefore decided to play a trick. He declared that he would cut the dam near Cairo, depriving all of the Mamluks of water. The Mamluks believed that Muhammad Ali would bring all of his troops to the dam, therefore leaving Cairo undefended. But the dam had been cut the night before, and the city was filled with troops. So once the Mamluks arrived in the city, the gates were closed, and Muhammad Ali's hidden soldiers massacred them. Al-Alfi managed to escape, but in quick succession, both he and al-Bardisi died, causing the Mamluk forces to break down in mutiny. Meanwhile, after the Battle of Austerlitz, Selim III decided to align the Ottoman Empire with Napoleon. This meant he was now at war with Russia and Britain. The reason he joined Napoleon's side is somewhat similar to why the Ottomans joined Germany in World War I. Napoleon promised to crush the Serbian rebels that had risen up in 1804, and there was also the promise of recapturing the land from Russia. Plus, the Sultan also had plans of aligning with Tipu Sultan in India, just like Napoleon did. So the British sailed to attack the Ottomans, but again, similar to World War I, their Dardanelles campaign failed. They instead sent troops to occupy Alexandria as part of the Fraser expedition. Before this, the British had been in communication with Al-Alfi, hoping he'd align with them, but they only heard about his death after they had landed. Nevertheless, they marched on into Rosetta. Muhammad Ali and many of his former enemies rode out to meet the British and crushed them at Al-Hamed in 1807. The British then retreated from Egypt in September, and peace was made. They promised to protect the integrity of the Ottoman Empire with their fleet and the supply of weapons. And they also made assurances that no warships should enter the Dardanelles Strait. In Egypt, though, Muhammad Ali had become a bit of a hero. He finally offered the Mamluk leaders control of provinces like Fayum in exchange for peace. He was now safe, in control of the country, and he created a dynasty which would continue to rule and expand Egypt. Mamluk threat did remain, but that would be dealt with later on. First, he began to look for more land to conquer, and he turned to the Wahhabis of Arabia. Their expansion from very early on was challenged by nearby rulers, like Suleiman Pasha in Baghdad, but his invasion of Diriyah was halted in 1797. So the Wahhabis were free to expand, taking over Mecca and Medina, and they sacked the Shia holy city of Karbala. The Ottomans in Constantinople were left humiliated, and needed to check their advance. So Mahmud II requested that Muhammad Ali invade their lands. In theory, this would, in the Sultan's eyes, weaken both powers that threatened their rule. Yet the Egyptians easily landed in Yanbu and captured Medina in 1812. Mecca was captured a couple months later, and by 1815, the Egyptians had killed the leaders of tribes like the Zahran and forced the Wahhabis out of Hijaz. The Saudis agreed to become a vassal of the Ottomans, but peace wouldn't last long. Ibrahim Pasha, Muhammad Ali's son, marched into the heart of Saudi territory on a particularly brutal campaign. Towns were torched and civilians were massacred on his way to Diriyah. They arrived at the Saudi capital in 1818 and razed it to the ground. Abdullah bin Saud was then sent to Constantinople to be executed, and the first Saudi state had come to an end. Back in Egypt, though, Muhammad Ali formulated a plan to finally rid himself of the Mamluk threat. He invited all of the leaders to a ceremony procession, honoring the expeditions against the Wahhabis. But when they entered a narrow passageway, the gates at either end were shut, and soldiers fired upon them from the walls, killing the 3,000 that attended. Many fled south into Sudan, but Muhammad Ali would invade the country to root them out. There was, however, another reason for his invasion of Sudan. As Muhammad Ali said, "You are aware that the end of all our effort in this expense is to procure Negroes." He believed an army of Sudanese slaves would be vital to end factionalism within his country, almost like the Black Guard of Morocco. and the workers would be vital in modernizing his country. Sudan at that time was made up of a collection of states, like Sennar, and they proved to be no match for Muhammad Ali's rapidly modernizing forces. The country was therefore occupied pretty quickly, slaves poured into Egyptian markets, and from here, there would be further campaigns into Ethiopia, Darfur, and the likes. While all of this was going on, the Ottoman sultans had their own, more immediate issues to deal with. For starters, the Serbians were rebelling, the British tried to attack their capital, and there was the Edirne incident of 1806. This was actually the second Edirne incident within 100 years, and both times it involved rebelling Janissaries. The Janissaries by this point were clearly outdated, and in many cases a little out of control. For instance, when the Ottomans reclaimed Serbia in the late 18th century, the Janissaries launched a series of reprisal attacks on the population. Selim banished the Janissaries from Belgrade, but they found sanctuary in the lands of Osman Pasvan-Toglu. Now, I should say that although I've been mainly focusing on the Middle East, the Ottomans suffered from similar problems of rebellious leaders in the Balkans as well. Osman was a soldier that gathered together an army of mercenaries in the late 18th century and captured land around Vidin. At certain points, this land stretched from Varna to Belgrade. He would also mint his own coins, conduct his own diplomatic missions and the likes. So the Sultan really had little control over most of his empire. To try and change this and reverse the loss of territories, Selim pushed for Tajdid, or renewal. Foreign advisors were brought in, and they helped build the new army. They were equipped with modern rifles, trained in the latest drills, and generally operated much like a European army. They were vital in defending the Levant from Napoleon's invasions, but in order to pay for these new troops, new taxes and financial reforms were implemented as part of the new treasury. These financial reforms would in turn end the possibility of people like Osman or the various Middle Eastern rulers ruling their territory virtually independently. But Selim lacked the resources and support to centralize such a large and diverse empire. And it also became clear that Osman could not be subdued. So in 1799, Osman, along with the Janissaries, were pardoned and many returned to Belgrade. They subsequently killed the governor of the city in 1801 and, in defiance of the Sultan, introduced high taxes, forced labor, and brutal punishments. Their killing of 72 Serbian noblemen in 1804 actually began the First Serbian Uprising. And strangely, the Ottomans were prepared to send troops to aid the Serbians in driving out the renegade Janissaries. But the army that was sent to Belgrade was the New Army, and a collection of nobles in the Balkans unified to try and curtail their advances and Selim's reforms in general. They closed off the towns on the way to Serbia and denied the New Army aid. And even the locals attacked them, like in Tekirdağ. There the Ottomans replaced the governor, but the replacement was lynched by Janissaries. In response, the Sultan had to send ships to bombard the city, yet the attacks on the New Army continued. So the New Army retreated to Korlu, which they had to besiege before entering. Selim, fearing a civil war, ordered the New Army to retreat to Constantinople, humiliated. This all but ended his ambitions to centralize the empire. And to appease the more conservative elements in his empire, he made Ibrahim Hilmi Pasha, the leader of the Janissaries, his new Grand Vizier. Selim was barely a complete liberal himself though. For instance, he tried to ban alcohol and threatened to kill people who sold it. But in general, his modernization programs angered too many people. And once he got back to his palace, his position was far from safe. The next challenge came from the Yamaks. These were soldiers tasked with guarding the coast from attack. They were usually mobilized men or volunteers, and were somewhat infamously poorly trained and lacked discipline. Well, Selim had tried to reform them and required them to wear new uniforms and be retrained. They refused to do this though, killed the Sultan's men, and appointed Kabachi Mustafa to be their leader. Janissaries then joined them en route to the capital, and they received support from many Islamic scholars as well. They surrounded the palace and demanded that Selim abolish all of the new institutions, and he resigned in favor of Mustafa IV in 1807. Bakci, the former Yamak, was made a minister, but he still had considerable backing and an army of rebels under his command. Well, not so much under his command, as these Janissaries and Yamaks continued to plunder the capital for around 14 months. In this anarchy, the old supporters of Selim decided that it was time to reinstate him. They were led by Alamdar Mustafa, who ruled around Ruz. They sent a fleet of ships to bombard Kabakchi's headquarters, killing the man, and then they sent troops into Constantinople. Mustafa, realizing that his position was now under threat, ordered the assassination of his imprisoned cousin Selim. The assassins included the Master of the Wardrobe and the Chief Black Eunuch. Selim's body was then presented to the rebels outside of the palace. Mustafa had also ordered the execution of his own half-brother Mahmud. But Mahmud managed to escape, and he became the new champion of the rebels' cause. They stormed the palace, and Mustafa was arrested and later killed. Mahmud II became the new sultan, and he would finally disband the Janissaries later on. And because of his many modernization efforts, he would actually be called the Peter the Great of Turkey. But rebellions continued in Serbia, and soon the Greeks would also rise up against Turkish rule. There were, of course, other problems in the various provinces of the empire as well. Sidon and Damascus were both ruled over by Jazar Pasha, but he died in 1804. This was welcomed by many, as he began to get more and more cruel. His name, Al-Jazar, actually means the butcher, because of his treatment of Bedouin in particular. But he also killed many Shia, and forced nearly every minority to pay heavy taxes. Eventually, Kunj Yusuf took over Damascus, and he quickly began to target minorities. For instance, Christians and Jews were forced to wear different coloured turbans. Yet, strangely, he also filled his court with Jews and Christians as well. While in Sidon, Suleiman Pasha al-Adil took over. Suleiman was actually a Mamluk who had been bought by Jazar, and in Tripoli, Mustafa Aga Barber was persecuting Alawites. Keep these names in mind for later on, as there was another powerful ruler in the region, Bashir Shahab II. He had risen to power in the late 18th century, but was usually under the control of Al-Jazar, having to provide troops and taxes to him. Yet he was still a powerful Christian ruler, albeit a secret Christian, of the Shahab dynasty, that had ruled Mount Lebanon for a century. Some of his predecessors were ousted because they had sided with rebels like Zahir al-Umar. And of course, there were all sorts of regional disputes in this land. But Bashir was able to consolidate his rule after Al-Jazar's death. Well, Bashir, along with the leaders of Damascus, Sidon and Tripoli, would all fight one another. Kunj Yusuf Pasha took his troops from Damascus to assault Mustafa Aga Barber in Tripoli in 1808, but his army of mainly Albanian mercenaries would be driven back. Barber, now in full control of Tripoli, continued to strike at the Alawites, and then turned on the Ismaili Shias. As for Kunj Yusuf, by this point he was somewhat desperate, as the Wahhabis had cut off the pilgrimage route to Mecca, and therefore he lost a great deal of money. He increased taxes, especially on religious minorities, and launched reprisal attacks on tribes like the Harfush. But then the Wahhabis actually broke out of Arabia and moved into Mazarib. They demanded that they convert to Wahhabism or face an attack on Damascus itself. Kunj didn't have the weapons or men to counter this new threat, so he tried to delay the Wahhabis while appealing to nearby provinces for help. Again, to put this into some sort of comparison, imagine the French invaded Wales and the Welsh appealed to the Scottish for help, while the government in London did nothing. Well, Suleiman Pasha of Sidon and Bashir of Lebanon obliged, and sent men to defend Damascus. This army of Kurds, Albanians, Druze, and a collection of other troops didn't make it to Damascus before the Egyptians invaded Wahhabi lands and ended the threat. Kunj told the other leaders to retreat, but they instead decided to take advantage of this situation. Suleiman Pasha, with the backing of the Sultan, took over Damascus. Suleiman, however, had a huge problem. He was a Mamluk, and just across the border, Muhammad Ali had massacred them. This was the main base of the Mamluks for centuries, and the infrastructure of buying slaves and training them up began to collapse. Some did manage to escape to Damascus, while Suleiman purchased a couple thousand more. But this wouldn't be enough to rule over the whole province. Instead, strangely, the Kurdish cavalry commander, Shamding Aga, largely took over the actual city of Damascus. These Kurdish horsemen had been brought in years earlier to help defend the city, and they were given their own quarters. But now they were the paramilitary rulers of it. Others were appointed to the role of governor of Damascus, like Siladar Suleiman Pasha, but he wouldn't be accepted by the Janissaries and they rebelled. So again, Janissaries are also in the city to, in theory, impose the will of the Sultan. In fact, 5 people would try to be governor between 1816 and 1819. Suleiman would then die in 1819, leaving Abdullah Pasha in control of Sidon. But he in turn would start a war with Bashir in Mount Lebanon. Once again, just to reiterate, these were not nations, these were all provinces of the same empire. There were some peaceful provinces at that time, like Iraq. The Jalili family still ruled in Mosul, and the Mamluks clung to power in Baghdad. That's not to say they were completely peaceful though. Suleiman II, for instance, tried to oust the Mamluk ruler, Suleiman Pasha the Little. He, by the way, is no relation to Suleiman Pasha in Sidon. But Suleiman's son-in-law, Dawood Pasha, took up the fight against the Ottomans. By 1816, he managed to take Baghdad and would rule for the next 15 years. He was actually quite a modern leader. He employed Europeans to train his army, brought the printing press to the city, and began construction on infrastructure projects. However, Mamluk rule wouldn't last for much longer. So the Mamluks of Egypt have all but disappeared as a major force. The Janissaries have managed to cling to their power in some of the provinces, but the greatest demise struck the North African Barbary pirates. Their power was already on the decline due to internal disputes, and, of course, the rapid development of European ships. But still, they were feared. So, European nations continued to pay them tribute every year to assure their safe passage in the Mediterranean Sea. However, America had just achieved their independence, and they quickly had to pay these pirates for safe passage or pay the ransom for hostages. This was a great sum of money to the Americans, roughly equivalent to 1/6 of their entire national budget. Then, in 1801, Thomas Jefferson received demands from Yusuf Karamanli, the Pasha of Tripolitania. He wanted to be paid just as much tribute as the other states. But by this point, the American Navy had gained experience in the Quasi-Wars, and their public was sick of this arrangement. So Jefferson declined the demands, and war was declared. The Americans, though, were not alone. The Barbary pirates had been taking advantage of the Napoleonic Wars, and began capturing even more ships and demanding ransoms, while the rest of Europe was distracted. Yet 2 nations were not really part of the Napoleonic Wars at this time: Sweden and Sicily. The Swedish had a ship captured by Tripolitania in 1797. They paid the ransom, but then another ship was taken, and then another. So in 1800, they decided to attack Tripoli themselves, while Sicily lived under constant threat of pirate attacks and slave raids. So they agreed to send ships and men to help out. Tripoli was blockaded, and there were a couple of small naval battles. But all of this was ineffective. So the Americans changed tactics. They learned that Yusuf Karamanli had exiled his own brother in order to become Pasha. Marines then landed in Alexandria in Egypt and marched on Tripoli, looking to replace Yusuf Karamanli with his brother. But in late April 1805, Yusuf sued for peace. He was able to keep his power, but the Tripolitanians were unable to ever collect tribute again. The Karamanlis would now have to find new ways to make money. So they looked to bring back the trans-Saharan slave routes. However, the Europeans were now banning the slave trade at this time, so they couldn't really make a great deal of money from it. Taxes were also raised, but of course, this just encouraged rebellions, especially among the Al-Jawazi tribe in particular. Yusuf Karamanli invited the leaders of this tribe to meet with him to discuss peace in a castle. But in scenes reminiscent of the Red Wedding, as soon as the leaders and their men sat down, they were slaughtered. The soldiers then went outside to the camps where the women and children were and proceeded to slaughter them as well. In total, around 10,000 people were killed that day in 1816. The Karamanlis did have some success in expanding their realm though. To the south of the coastal towns there was Fezzan. This had long been ruled over by the Aulad Muhammad, a tribe that had been there since the middle of the 1500s. They'd often been attacked by their neighbors throughout the centuries, but finally, in 1812, they were subdued. So Tripolitania was weakened, but this was just one of the Barbary states though. Over in Algiers, the power struggles continued. By this point though, it was somewhat similar to the Roman Empire, inasmuch as one man would assassinate the Dey and become Dey himself. Like Ahmed bin Ali Kodja killed Mustafa II and became Dey in 1805. Then, from 1805 to 1818, there would be 7 days in total. And Algiers continued to drift far away from the Ottomans, despite, in theory, being part of their empire. This drift affected a great deal, obviously, but in some ways you might not suspect. like the ethnic makeup of their armies and leaders. For a couple centuries, the Odjaks had defended the Dey, and initially, no locals could join them. But by this period, maybe out of desperation, maybe because they had the freedom to do so, they recruited locals. They still only made up 1/7 of the unit, but this is far better than anywhere else. Algiers would even, albeit for a very short time, have an Algerian Dey, known as Ali Kodja. But these Odjaks became even more powerful and very often corrupt. Ahmed, who became Dey in 1805, was forced to listen to their commands. But still, he did some pretty brutal things all by himself. Jewish areas were looted and various groups were massacred, so the Kabyle tribes, the Darqawiya Sufis, and many others rose up in rebellion. Worse though, so too did the Tunisians. They weren't ruled by the Algerians, but ever since the middle of the 18th century, they had to pay tribute. But now Hamouda ibn Ali was the Dey of Tunisia, and he began improving relations with the Sultan and modernizing his army. So when Ahmed demanded even more tribute, the Tunisians refused, and sent tens of thousands of men into battle. Using modern weapons like cannons, they were able to win and break free from Algerian influence. This defeat caused even more problems in Algiers. Ahmed was deposed and killed by the Odjaks, who promoted one of their own. But even he didn't last long. Haji Ali would come to power in 1809 and aggressively try to make more money by attacking more ships, including those that belonged to the Ottoman Empire. However, they also began to attack American ships. By this point though, the Americans were focused on fighting the British in the War of 1812, so they really didn't do anything about it. It was only in 1815, when America ended their war with Britain, that President Madison dispatched the now large American Navy to North Africa. They arrived in June and quickly defeated the Algerians in naval battles and forced them to pay reparations. Now America had free passage throughout the Mediterranean. Then, in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, the European powers agreed to also suppress the pirates. A combined British and Dutch fleet set sail for Algiers and bombarded the city in 1816, forcing the Dey to free thousands of Christian slaves. Omar Aga had just been made Dey before the war, and now he had to deal with the loss of even more money and the loss of thousands of slaves. So he forced the Jewish residents of Algiers into forced labor, or essentially slavery. He was assassinated in 1817 though, and replaced by Ali Kodja, the native Dey. Or he was at least known as a Kulu Glis though, which in this context meant he was half native. He'd been involved in a couple of assassinations before taking power, and now he had over 1,500 Janissaries executed. Again, they are still involved. Plus, he made alliances with the tribes that had been in near-constant rebellion, but he died of plague in 1818, making him one of the last Deys of Algiers. Across the border in Morocco, Suleiman was still the leader. He, however, was turning Morocco backwards almost. After centuries of trade with Europe, he decided to encourage their merchants to leave his country, and he began cutting off ties. There was a good reason for this, though. He was shocked at the French invasion of Syria and Egypt and the slaughter of his fellow Muslims. He would even, albeit incredibly briefly, join in the First Barbary War to defend Tripoli. He was, in short, an incredibly religious man. So when the Wahhabis wrote to him describing their ideology, he was pretty impressed. He followed a lot of their teachings by condemning music, taking down shrines and the likes. Under his rule though, besides the odd punitive expedition against tribes and the likes, Morocco was somewhat peaceful. But plagues and foreign intervention would soon change that. However, going across to the other side of the region, the Barbary Wars weren't the only wars in this period against pirates. As over in the Persian Gulf, the Qasimi tribe had also been attacking passing ships for years. But as the British East India Company were taking over more of India, their trade in the region began to increase. Plus, because many of Britain's fighting ships had been busy in the Napoleonic Wars, many of their trading vessels were travelling almost undefended. This meant many of Britain's trading ships were being captured and turned into pirate ships. They added these captured British ships to their fleet of already hundreds of dhows. Plus, given their success, thousands of Bedouins joined their ranks, so they had up to 20,000 men and were developing a pretty powerful naval force. The British therefore needed help, and they turned to Said of Oman. Together they sent warships into the Gulf in 1808, but still the attacks continued. For instance, that year, 50 pirate ships began raiding off the coast of Sindh in Pakistan, where they captured a large British ship and massacred the crew. The British finally decided to act. They arrived at Ras Al Khaimah with a much larger fleet and bombarded the defences while they made an amphibious landing. As the Arabs fled, the British torched the warehouses, ammunition stores, and dozens of ships. Further operations were launched against smaller towns until, believing the pirates were crippled, they left. However, this campaign was part of some larger diplomatic moves. For starters, the Persians were coming close to forming an alliance with the French, which I'll get onto in a bit. Plus, it's important to remember the Qasimi had sided with the House of Saud. So, the British were technically attacking Wahhabi lands here. Yet the Wahhabis fell a couple years later, and the Qasimi were left on their own again, and again they began to conduct raids. These grew worse in 1815 and continued to grow. By 1819, more British ships arrived in the Gulf, and they made a deal with Said of Oman, offering him control of the pirate coast in return for his help. He only sent a couple of ships to help out though, as once again Ras Al Khaimah was attacked. Once they destroyed the town's fort, the British moved on to Sharjah, Dubai, and the other villages along the coast. Not a single Brit was lost in the engagements, and now nearly every sheikh was in British custody. Doha in Qatar would also be attacked, but there was very little central authority for the British to negotiate with. Once it was all over, the Chief Secretary of Bombay rejected the idea of allowing Oman to take over the region, so the British forced the sheikhs to sign the General Treaty of Maritime Peace. This would end piracy and set the stage for the creation of the Trucial States, which would become part of the British Empire. Although largely, the sheikhs would keep their power and continue to rule independently. But going back to Oman though, they, like everywhere else, had succession issues. Like when Sultan bin Ahmed died in 1804, his brother Qais bin Ahmed tried to seize the throne from his own nephews. Before that, Badia bin Saif, the nephew of the Sultan bin Ahmed, tried to take power by weirdly smuggling himself into a fort in a large wooden box. He was captured and fled to Qatar, where he met the Wahhabis, adopted their beliefs, and asked for their help. As Qais bin Ahmed struggled for the throne, Badia bin Saif returned with Wahhabi help and took over the position of regent in 1804. However, he quickly began to anger nearly everyone. After all, Oman was largely an Abadi nation, so Wahhabism was far from accepted. Plus, Badia was destroying their minarets, paying tribute to the Saudis, and letting their soldiers occupy Omani lands. So he was assassinated, and one of the sons of Sultan bin Ahmed was able to take control. This was Said, who ruled over Oman at their height. They still held colonies over in Africa, and of course were fighting against the tribes on the pirate coast. There were also some pirates in Oman itself, like the Bani Bu Ali, but with the help of the East India Company, they were also crushed in 1820. One place Oman continued to try and invade though was Bahrain. In 1799, Oman invaded the island for a while, but the Bani Utbah chased them out. In 1800 and in 1802, Omani forces tried again, but the ruling Al-Khalifas asked the Wahhabis for help. Yet again though, this would be an uneasy alliance, as the island was filled with many Shia Muslims. So, stuck between the Persians, who often invaded them, Oman, and the Wahhabis, the Al-Khalifas asked Britain for help. They signed a treaty of friendship, again expanding British influence in the region. While just across the water, the Persians were still on the decline. Fatih Ali Shah was the ruler at the beginning of the century, and his Qajar dynasty had decided to move the capital to Tehran. And this is off topic, but one of the titles he gave himself was Master of the Encyclopedia Britannica, because after receiving the books as a gift, he read them all. However, he would have to deal with Russian invasions. The Russians, after all, still claimed Georgia, which the Qajar had retaken by massacring their way through just a few years earlier. So the Russians moved back into the region in 1804, starting a war. The Persians, desperate for help, asked both the British and Napoleon for aid. After all, Persia was still a divided country with very few taxpayers, a large nomadic population, and a very weak army. Napoleon obliged and signed the Franco-Persian alliance. But then Napoleon made peace with Russia, so this was pretty much useless. The Russians continued south, and by 1813 they had reached Tabriz. The Persians were forced to sign the Treaty of Gulistan, ceding all of Georgia, Dagestan, and Azerbaijan to the Russian Empire. They did manage to keep hold of Armenia though, but soon the Russians would come for that as well. So Persia's only real chance to expand was over in the east, and luckily for them, the Durrani Empire was also on the decline. This empire, like others, would be torn apart from succession crises from the beginning. They had already begun to lose control over Kalat in the south, then Timur Shah died in 1793, and all of his sons began to fight one another for decades. The first to take power was Zaman Shah, but he led a disastrous war against the new Sikh Empire. Many tribal leaders then turned to his brother instead, Mahmud Shah. He blinded and killed his brother, but then another brother, known as Shuja, would oust Mahmud. Shuja, by the way, signed the first treaty with the British, promising not to allow any foreign armies through his country. However, he was a cruel leader. Foreign visitors remarked that nearly everybody in his court had missing body parts, as he just seemed to enjoy cutting off people's noses and ears. These two brothers continued to play a part in Afghani politics until the 1840s. Mahmud would only be able to rule one province over in Herat, while Shuja would form an alliance of sorts with the British. But they weren't the only brothers fighting for power. Abbas Mirza made an attempt to take over Kabul in 1810. Ali Shah seized power for a year in 1818 before being strangled by another brother. Then Ayub Shah took over briefly in 1819. The Qajar rulers of Persia took advantage of this and tried to take over Herat. This place had largely become independent during the civil wars, and they also fought a number of small conflicts with the Persians over the border fort of Gorian. However, these were regional wars fought between Herat and Khorasan, as both Afghanistan and Persia were highly decentralized. Within Khorasan, there would be further internal conflicts as well. Like in 1813, the tribal chiefs overthrew their leader, Muhammad Vali, the son of the Shah. This group of chiefs led an alliance of all sorts of ethnicities, like the Karai Turks, the Kurds, and many others. So the ruler of Herat, Firuz al-Din, tried to strike. Persian reinforcements arrived and countered, and this sort of attack, rebellion and the likes would continue from around 1800 to 1818. Another example of this came in 1817. Persian troops attacked Jam, slaughtered Hazaras, built a tower out of their skulls, and marched onto the territory of the Aimaq people. But there they were defeated and forced to retreat. Firuz al-Din asked for help in fighting back the Persians, but the Durrani rulers sent Fateh Khan to aid them. He was the Pashtun leader of the Barakzai tribe. For a while he had worked alongside Mahmud Shah in his fight against his brothers, and against foreign threats. For instance, he fought unsuccessfully to defend Attock from the invading Sikh armies. Fateh and this Barakzai tribe had actually helped Mahmud come to the throne. This is because their father Payinder was killed by Mahmud's brother Shuja. So with Mahmud on the throne, Fateh's power began to increase, and he used it to put members of the Barakzai family into positions of power across the country. These members were usually divided into different branches, based on who their mother was. This is because Payinder had many sons to many different women. So Muhammad Azim took Peshawar, Atar Muhammad took lands near Kashmir, Nawab Asad took Derajat, and his son took over Jalalabad. A group of brothers known as the Dil brothers, Ramdil, Purdil, Sherdil, and Kuhandil, took Kandahar, Ghazni, and Bamatan, and these brothers will become very important later on. And there was Dost Muhammad. His mother was a Shia Turkic Kizilbash, and he was made deputy of Kabul. So the country had in just a few years been split among this one tribe, and Mahmud Durrani was seemingly just too worried to challenge Fateh. After all, there were still pretenders waiting to be made king. Well, Fateh rode to Herat with Dost Muhammad and sacked the city, even attacking the women with the harem, including the relatives of Mahmud Shah. This, alongside his paranoia that the Barakzai were trying to seize more power, led Mahmud to send his son Kamran to Herat in 1818. The Barakzai, however, had just defeated the Qajar Persians and were not prepared to hand over control. After all, they had also helped Mahmud Shah take power a couple of times before. So Kamran made other plans. He invited Fateh Khan to a feast and ordered him to be blinded, tortured, killed, and allegedly scalped, although there are other reports saying that he was chopped up and beheaded. Herat was therefore brought back under control. Dost Muhammad fled to Kashmir, where he was held by his elder half-brother, Muhammad Azim Khan. But he was soon let go and allowed to march on Kabul. He had already built up some support among the locals during his time there, and gained the support of the Qizilbash through his mother's connections. He quickly took over the city and installed Ali Shah Durrani on the throne as a puppet ruler. But Mahmud Shah still ruled over in Herat, so Afghanistan had pretty much disintegrated. An Uzbek chief named Murad Beg took over Badakhshan, Ranjit Singh, the ruler of the Sikh Empire, took over Multan and Kashmir, Sindh broke free, and the group of Barakzai brothers, the Dil, declared their independence in Kandahar. Afghanistan now entered years of civil war.